In the case of Flight 38, this theory is immediately questioned.
Jet fuel has a certain odour. Anyone who has worked with an aircraft will know the distinctive smell of Jet A1 fuel. There was certainly a lot of fuel leaking from the aircraft, from the ruptures to the bottom of the engines when we arrived on site.
A check of the plane's dipsticks confirms 2 of the tanks did in fact have fuel.
So we knew that there was plenty of fuel on board this aircraft to complete the flight.
There remain several other possible explanations for such a loss of power, and investigators must tackle them all. There is great confidence that the mystery can be solved, as any and every piece of evidence investigators could ever want is readily available. They have access to the pilot, the crew, and most importantly, the entire plane.
We were quite fortunate to have the amount of data that we had on this aircraft. Because the aircraft remained intact, we were able to interrogate lots of computers and also get lots of data from the recorders. Additionally, we had data external to the aircraft, such as radar data and also the radio transmissions as well.
Mark Ford retrieves the plane's flight data recorders, which promise to give investigators important clues. He has another resource, the QAR, or Quick Access Recorder. While the black boxes are in the rear of the plane, the QAR is a data recorder in the front, used mainly for diagnostics.
It does have an advantage over the flight recorder, though, in that it has a greater memory capacity and can record additional parameters over and above those available on the flight recorder. You can recover the data from a quick access recorder within a matter of minutes in some cases.
Speed, altitude, control settings, cockpit conversations. In all, the various recorders have preserved 1,400 different pieces of data, which should help the investigators close the case. But when they study the QAR, what they find is chilling.
The quick access recorder data stopped about 45 seconds prior to the accident itself. Initial thoughts were that there was an electrical problem, possibly that had affected not only the QAR, but possibly the engines as well.
The 777 is one of the latest advances to computer-assisted airplanes. Pilots don't directly control the plane. Instead, their inputs are sent to a computer. Those signals are then relayed to the engines, flaps, and other systems on the aircraft.
Pete, I can't get power on the engines.
A massive failure of the plane's information systems could explain why the engine stopped working. Perhaps the computers that control them froze. Farnborough is home to the AAIB. The flight data recorder has been sent here for analysis. An electrical problem would be recorded on this device. But interpreting the information will take some time. Time investigators don't have. There are hundreds of 777s landing every day. They need to find answers before whatever brought down Flight 38 strikes again. While they wait, authorities turn their attention to the fuel recovered from the ruined plane. A bad batch of fuel could have deprived the aircraft of power just when it needed it most.
Well, fuel can be contaminated in many different ways. It can be particle contamination, it can be biological contamination, and they can get into filters to restrict the flow.
We took several samples from various points within the fuel system. So not only from the fuel tank itself, but also from remnants within fuel lines and also within various fuel components.
We managed to trace the fuel back through the documentation to a shipment of Jet A1 which came from South Korea, and that was shipped across in a tanker to China and was then transported by pipeline to Beijing Airport. We compared it with over 1,200 other batches of fuel in the UK, and it came out to be very good.
Investigators next consider the possibility of a blockage in the fuel tanks. They discover some bizarre evidence. Several small pieces of tape are recovered, along with something else.
When we were in the fuel tanks, we did find a few small articles. One of them was a red scraper.
The items were likely left over from when the plane was built 7 years ago. But while they're peculiar, there's no indication that any of them played a role in bringing down the plane.
Obviously, it's not ideal to find anything within a fuel tank. We obviously looked to see whether this would have had an effect on the fuel flow to the engines. The items were so small, they would not have caused a restriction.
As the search for answers continues, a puzzling find surfaces. Less than 3 years before the Heathrow crash, another 777 suffered a serious mid-air problem. After taking off in Perth, Australia, a Malaysian passenger jet was climbing through 38,000 feet when suddenly the plane's autopilot pitched the nose up and climbed steeply. Calamity was only averted when the pilot took manual control of the jet.
They did manage to get it safely back to base. The investigators established that this was a computer problem.
British aviation authorities consider that the electronic brain of one of the world's most reliable jets might be faulty.
The Malaysian Airlines aircraft was really quite an unnerving one. The investigators sort of pulled out the files on it and started looking over it to try and get some clues.
Did we have a problem with the electronic control system, causing the engines to roll back?
If flaws are found with Flight 38's computers, it means 777s around the world could all be disasters in the making. This thought hangs heavily over the industry. When the readout of the plane's flight data recorder is conducted in Farnborough, investigators learn that the crash could have been much worse.
There was very little they could actually have done.
It looks like we had double engine failure.
There was only 30 seconds between when they were fully aware of what was going on.
Airspeed low.
And the accident was inevitable.
Records show that soon after the engines failed, the plane started falling faster than 1,800 feet a minute, a very steep descent. But lack of power was only one factor working against the crew. They had extended their flaps on descent. It helps control the plane at lower speeds by increasing lift, but the extended flaps create drag, which slows the plane down. It takes more power to keep the plane flying with a wider wing.
Airspeed low.
I needed to raise the flaps. I knew that by raising it one notch to flap 25 would be the right thing to do. To reduce the drag, that's what I had to do.
Now what he did here gave them a few extra feet.
Had the flaps been left at flaps 30, the aircraft would have struck the ground just before a set of ILS antennas.
The plane then would have slammed into the antennas, sustaining even more damage and increasing the chances of serious injuries. For their efforts, Burkill and his team are considered heroes.
Flying is about teamwork, and we had an outstanding team.
There is no doubt. Without the flight crew's actions, Flight 38's landing would have been a catastrophe.
Now, the recordings
As they continue examining data from the flight data recorders,
continue right until the moment of impact.
investigators are no closer to solving the case.
Analysis of the flight recorder didn't identify any particular fault with the aircraft electrical system that would have resulted in both engines rolling back.
They are at least able to determine why no data was found on the quick access recorder for the last 45 seconds of the flight. It's not an electrical fault as they first feared.
The 45-second delay in the QAR recording was a result of the fact that the QAR doesn't record in real time. It buffers the data and then will record approximately 45 seconds later.
With all the information from the plane's various data recorders now collected, investigators have a precise picture of what happened. The jet was on the proper course as it made its approach to land, when things went horribly wrong.
At 720 feet, the right engine rolled back. 7 seconds later, the left engine rolled back. The autothrottle attempted to command greater thrust.
It's not me, that's the autothrottle.
But the engines didn't respond.
I can't get power on the engines.
While electrical and computer problems are ruled out as causes of the crash, The flight data recorders do point investigators to the likely source of the problem.
The two most significant parameters from the quick X recorder were the fuel metering valves. Both those valves indicated that they had opened to their fully open position.
The plane's computers were calling for as much fuel from the tanks as possible. The valves were fully open, but not nearly enough fuel was reaching the engines. A plane with plenty of fuel and a working computer system still crash-landed, and investigators can't determine why. They focus on the weather on the day of the accident.
It was a very cold air mass over Siberia, so we were aware of the cold conditions, but the flight was expected to be smooth and also quick.
The plane's path took them high over Russia. The outside temperature went as low as -74 degrees centigrade. It's a potentially dangerous temperature if not monitored closely.
In cold air masses, you have to be very aware of the fuel temperatures.
When fuel starts to freeze, it produces wax. As the fuel temperature drops, the wax becomes greater within the fuel itself until it comes to a point where it can no longer flow.
We have a fuel temperature gauge on the flight deck, which is monitored at all times, and I personally look at that every time I do a fuel check, which minimum is once an hour. Basically, you don't want to get it below -34 degrees centigrade.
While they were cold, the temperatures never dipped into the danger zone where the fuel could wax and clog the system. And the fuel temperature increased significantly as the jet approached London.
We were coming through 20,000 feet, and I remember seeing -20 degrees centigrade, so it had already started to warm up.
Another potential cause of the crash is ruled out. Investigators are now running out of possible explanations.
And the expectation from the media, and also from aviation experts, was that we would have the answer within days.
But there was no comment today about the ongoing investigation.
It very quickly became apparent that that would not be the case.
They had the pilots, they had the passengers, they had the aircraft, they had everything there. Except the thing that caused it. That had disappeared. As if by magic.
Despite mountains of data and physical evidence at their disposal, investigators are still unable to say what caused the crash of a British Airways 777 at Heathrow Airport. They turn to a failure of the fuel delivery system as a culprit. To prove it was responsible, they need to pinpoint anything out of the ordinary about Flight 38's journey on January the 17th, 2008.
It's a daily flight operating from Beijing to Heathrow. We wanted to work out what was unique about this flight. Why this flight in particular?
If you've got a very puzzling incident, like the 777 accident at Heathrow, you're going to mine all the data you can.
Just put them over there for now.
So we approached many operators to obtain some data of previous flights so that we could then do a comparison.
Flight data is collected from companies around the world.
And we had something like 144,000 flights in all.
But it will take months of work to analyze this enormous volume of information. To study Flight 38's fuel system more closely, huge sections of it are brought to the AAIB hangar and reassembled.
It allowed us to basically just sit there and look at it and to brainstorm and come up with ideas as to what might have caused it.
McDermott and his team consider all possibilities, from design flaws to a malfunction specific to this aircraft. The examination comes up empty.
We carried out an exhaustive and very thorough inspection and testing of the fuel system, and we find nothing wrong.
Frustrated, investigators are at a dead end.
We kept going through this cycle, we kept going back over what we'd done before. Had we missed something? And every time we went back over, we kept coming back to no.
There was no trouble with the plane's computers. It had plenty of fuel. And no problems with the fuel itself. But somehow, when it was most vital...
Mayday!
the engines didn't get the fuel they needed.